Neanderthals never went extinct. Not completely. If your ancestors came from anywhere outside sub-Saharan Africa, you're carrying pieces of them right now. About 2 to 3% of your genome in every cell of your body. That number has been public since 2010, and it's the part most people have heard by now. What almost nobody has heard is what happened in February of 2026. 3 geneticists at the University of Pennsylvania published a paper about the strangest feature of the human genome. We thought that feature was already explained. They replaced the explanation with something nobody wanted to be the one to write down. We'll get there. It's the back half of this video, and it changes what these encounters actually were. But we have to start with how badly we got these people wrong in the first place. That story begins with one skeleton, one French scientist, and a mistake that stood for nearly 50 years. In 1908, 3 priests were digging in a small cave near the village of Chapelle-aux-Saints, pronounced La Chapelle-aux-Saints, in southwestern France. They pulled a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton out of the ground. It went to Marcellin Boule at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, the most respected authority on fossil humans alive at the time. Boule published his analysis between 1911 and 1913, and what he described was a monster. A curved spine, knees that couldn't fully straighten, a head slung forward on a thick neck, a big toe that stuck out sideways like a grasping ape foot, a brain he judged incapable of abstract thought or moral reasoning. Boule concluded that this animal could not have walked upright the way we do, and could not have thought the way we do. The man Boule was studying was sick. He had advanced osteoarthritis in his spine and jaw. He had lost most of his teeth years before he died, and the empty sockets had healed over. Somebody in his group was preparing food soft enough for a toothless old man to swallow. He was cared for. Boule looked at a lifetime of disease and drew it as the species. That drawing became the museum display. The museum display became the textbook illustration. The textbook illustration became the cartoon caveman with the club, and it has never left. In 1957, 2 anatomists named William Strauss and Alec Cave went back to the same bones and found the arthritis Boule had missed. If you clean this man up, they wrote, put him in a business suit and sat him on the New York subway, nobody would look twice. 45 years of certainty dismantled in a single paper. The picture stuck anyway. Say the word Neanderthal at a bar in Ohio tonight, and the image in every head at that table is still Boule's. Everything after this is the correction, and the correction came out of a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, built by a man who spent 2 decades being told the thing he wanted to do was flatly impossible. Svante Pääbo, pronounced Svante Pääbo, wanted to read the DNA of dead species. The obstacle is chemistry. DNA falls apart. After 40,000 years in a cave floor, what's left in a bone is shattered into fragments a few dozen letters long, chemically corroded, buried under bacterial DNA that moved in after death. Worse, it's buried under your DNA. And the DNA of whoever excavated the bone, and whoever washed it, and whoever filed it in a museum drawer in 1972. Imagine dumping 50 shredded paperbacks into a swimming pool, then trying to reassemble one specific paragraph, while somebody at the edge keeps tossing in shreds of the book you're holding. That was the problem, and for 20 years the field's honest answer was that it couldn't be solved. Pääbo's team solved it. The bones came from Vindiger Cave in Croatia. 3 fragments so unremarkable that nobody had bothered to work out which part of the body they came from. In May of 2010, they published a draft of the Neanderthal genome, and the comparison to living people returned a result that was not in anyone's plan. Everybody outside Africa was carrying Neanderthal DNA, not trace contamination, real, inherited, measurable ancestry. Pääbo took the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for it in 2022. 2 to 3% sounds like a rounding error. It isn't, because different people carry different fragments. Your 2% and your neighbour's 2% overlap only partly. Add up all the different pieces scattered across everyone alive today, and roughly 1/5 of the entire Neanderthal genome is still in circulation, spread thin across 8 billion people. They weren't erased from the planet, they were distributed across it. The distribution isn't even either. People with East Asian ancestry carry noticeably more Neanderthal DNA than people with European ancestry, and the reason for that gap is still being debated. The obvious next question is what that DNA is doing, and the answer is that most of it is still working. A large share of the surviving Neanderthal variants sit in immune genes, and the logic is clean. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems had already fought the local viruses, the local bacteria, the local parasites, and won often enough to pass the winning versions down. Modern humans walking north out of Africa had none of that experience. Interbreeding handed them a preloaded defense package that had been field tested for 250,000 years. Other pieces are stranger and more personal. Neanderthal variants influence keratin, the protein in skin and hair. They show up in genes that affect how easily your skin burns. There's a version of a gene called SCN9A, inherited from Neanderthals, that lowers the threshold at which nerve signals register as pain. If you're the person in your office who reacts hardest to a paper cut, that may be a Neanderthal nerve doing exactly what it did 50,000 years ago. Neanderthal variants are also associated with being a morning person. That fits a population living at high latitudes, with short winter days, moving the moment the light came up. The one that got everyone's attention arrived in 2020. Hugo Zeeberg and Pääbo found a long stretch of chromosome 3, inherited directly from Neanderthals, that substantially raises the risk of severe illness from COVID-19. A separate Neanderthal segment on chromosome 12 does the opposite and offers protection. People sitting in intensive care units in 2020 and 2021 were fighting a modern virus, partly with a genome written by a species that died before the invention of the wheel, so we knew there was contact. What we didn't know for a long time was when. That got settled in December of 2024, and it got settled under a castle. The site is a cave in Rennes, Germany. Bone fragments too, shattered for anyone to identify by eye, had been sitting in collections there since a dig in the 1930s. Protein screening flagged them as human. DNA sequencing turned them into 6 individuals, including a mother and her infant daughter, and 2 more women from the same extended family. Then the team compared them to a skull from Zlatý, pronounced Zlatý in Czechia, about 140 miles away. The woman from that skull was a distant cousin of the family at Rennes. 2 sites, 2 countries, 1 family tree, 45,000 years old. Their population was tiny. Modelling suggests something like 300 people spread across Central Europe. 300. That's a single American high school, scattered over an area the size of Texas and Oklahoma combined. And their genomes carried Neanderthal DNA from a single mixing event, one that every non-African alive today also carries, dated to somewhere between 45 and 49,000 years ago. A second study published the same week, led by Leonardo Iasi and Priya Morjani, put the start at about 50,500 years ago. The duration, roughly 7,000 years. 7,000 years is longer than all of recorded human history. It is also, against the hundreds of thousands of years these 2 species spent as neighbours, one narrow window. Almost all of the Neanderthal DNA in you came from that window. There's one fossil that shows what a single moment inside a window like that looked like, and it's the reason paleogeneticists talk about luck. Denisova Cave sits in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. In 2018, a team working through more than 2,000 unidentifiable bone scraps from the site sequenced a bone fragment barely more than an inch long. The individual was a girl, at least 13 years old when she died, roughly 90,000 years ago. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, pronounced Denisovan, a separate archaic human population known almost entirely from DNA rather than from bones. Not a distant hybrid ancestry, a first-generation child. Her parents were 2 different kinds of human being. We have maybe 24 archaic genomes of decent quality on this entire planet. Pulling a first-generation hybrid out of a sample, that small does not suggest these encounters were rare. It suggests they were routine, and when the team read her father's genome closely, they found a Neanderthal ancestor sitting several hundred generations back in his line too. It had happened before, running the other direction. Which brings us to the paper from February of 2026, and to the oddest feature of your own genome. Neanderthal DNA is not spread evenly through you. There are long stretches, called Neanderthal deserts, where the DNA is completely gone in every living person without exception. The largest desert of all is the X chromosome. It is close to empty. For 15 years, the explanation was hybrid incompatibility. Many of the genes on the X chromosome are tied to male fertility. When two lineages have been separated for 600,000 years, hybrid males are often sterile or close to it. Under that model, natural selection scrubbed Neanderthal DNA off the human X because it was, in the plainest possible sense, broken. Alexander Platt, Daniel Harris, and Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania decided to look through the other end of the telescope. Everyone had been measuring Neanderthal DNA inside modern humans. This team measured modern human DNA inside Neanderthals, using 3 Neanderthal genomes, checked against an African genome from a population that never had contact. The Neanderthals carried about 62% more modern human DNA on their X chromosomes than on the rest of their genome. Roughly 1.5 times the expected amount. A perfect mirror of the hole in ours. That number carries information, because X chromosomes travel through families in a lopsided way. A daughter receives 1 X from each parent. A son receives his only X from his mother. Run enough generations and the sex of the people doing the mixing leaves a signature in the arithmetic. The team simulated the alternatives. They tested whether an incoming group of modern humans made up entirely of women could produce the pattern. Even in that extreme, the math tops out around 1 1/3 times. To reach 1.5, the simplest explanation left standing is a mating preference, sustained across generations. Neanderthal men pairing with modern human women, again and again, in one direction far more often than the other. 2 things need saying about that. The signal comes from an old contact, more than 200,000 years ago, not from the pulse 47,000 years back. Other population geneticists have already pointed out that a preference at one point in time doesn't prove the same preference later. Selection may still account for part of the desert. This is a leading interpretation, not a closed case. The authors also declined deliberately to speculate about whether those pairings were chosen by everyone involved. DNA does not record consent. Then there is the question the genetics can't touch at all, which is what these people were actually like. In 1990, cavers in southwestern France opened a passage that had been sealed by collapse and crawled about 1,100 feet into the dark. What they found in Bruniquel Cave, pronounced Bruniquel, was architecture. Around 400 pieces of stalagmite snapped off at roughly equal lengths and stacked into 2 rings. The larger ring is more than 20 feet across. Burned bone and reddened stone show that fires had been lit on them. In 2016, the structures were dated to about 176,000 years ago. No modern humans existed in Europe then. Neanderthals built them 1/5 of a mile underground in total darkness. That means controlled fire carried in, a plan, and a group willing to walk into a place with no light, no food, and no obvious reason to go. At Krapina in Croatia, 8 white-tailed eagle talons were found cut, polished, and worn smooth where they had rubbed against something, about 130,000 years old. That's jewellery, made 80,000 years before modern humans reached Europe. Neanderthals also produced birch bark tar, an adhesive that requires heating bark in a low-oxygen container within a fairly narrow temperature range. That is not something you find lying around. It's a chemical process with steps. At Abri-du-Marat in France, researchers recovered a fragment of 3-ply cord, fibres twisted and then twisted again, about 50,000 years old. That's rope, which implies bags, nets, and binding. And they could probably talk about all of it. A Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small floating bone in the throat that anchors the tongue, was recovered at Kebara Cave in Israel in 1983. It is essentially identical to ours. In 2021, a team led by Mercedes Conde Valverde used CT scans of Neanderthal ear structures to model what they could hear. Their hearing was tuned to the same narrow frequency band that human consonants occupy. They had ears built for listening to speech. There are also claims of Neanderthal cave art. Red pigment at 3 Spanish caves, including La Pasiega and Ardales, was dated in 2018 to more than 64,000 years ago, well before modern humans arrived in Spain. That one is genuinely contested. Several researchers argue the dating method, which measures mineral crusts rather than the paint itself, can return ages older than the art underneath. treat it as an open argument rather than a settled fact. Some of them were redheads. A pigment variant found in Spanish and Italian Neanderthals points to red hair and pale skin. Their brains, for what it's worth, average slightly larger than ours by volume. Brain size is a crude measure, and it does not translate cleanly into intelligence. It does make the old caricature harder to defend, so they weren't stupid. Which leaves the hardest question of all, which is why they're gone. The answer coming out of the genomes is not about intelligence, it's about numbers. At Chagirskaya Cave in Siberia, researchers sequenced 11 individuals in 2022 and reconstructed the first known Neanderthal family group, including a father and his teenage daughter. The genetic diversity inside that group was extraordinarily low, down at levels we now see in populations on the edge of collapse. The earlier Altai Neanderthal genome showed something similar. Her parents were closely related, probably half-siblings. It keeps showing up. In March of 2026, researchers sequenced a male Neanderthal from Denisova Cave who lived about 110,000 years ago. His genome carried long identical stretches inherited from both parents. His mother and father were likely first cousins. A month later, DNA from 8 teeth at Stajnia Cave in Poland produced a group portrait of at least 7 Neanderthals living together around 100,000 years ago. It's the oldest such group ever reconstructed in Central Eastern Europe, and their maternal lineage links them to Neanderthals as far away as the Caucasus. Put it together, and the picture is small bands, a few dozen people each, thinly spread from Wales to Siberia, cycling through ice ages, running short of unrelated partners at the edges of their range. Then a population arrived from Africa with bigger networks, denser groups, and more of them. Nobody needs a war to explain what follows. When a small population keeps merging into a much larger one, generation after generation, the small one stops existing as something separate without ever losing a fight. The last Neanderthals we can date lived around 40,000 years ago. After that, nothing. Except that's the wrong way to end this, because it isn't what the DNA says. For 150 years we drew them as the failed draft, the rough version, the branch that didn't work. We built that image out of one arthritic old man in a French cave, and we kept it long after the evidence quit supporting it. A species that lost makes a better story than a species that merged. They didn't lose to us. They joined us. Every immune response you mount is running partly on code written by people who hunted in a Europe under ice. So is every burn you take too easily or shake off too fast. So is some part of how early you wake up and how much a small cut hurts. People who built fires 1/5 of a mile underground, who wore eagle talons, who fed their toothless elders and made rope. Somewhere out there tonight is a guy named Mark, on his couch with the lights off, carrying more of them in his blood than the person sitting next to him. Neither of them